What concerns have you had about speaking out?
That I'm gonna be murdered. One day I'm gonna be walking down the street and somebody's gonna come up and shoot me or something.
Trans activists have absolutely broken this 10-year-old's brain, and it's actually tragic. We're going to break down a truly wild CNN segment featuring multiple kids who identify as transgender and so much more. On today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where I take on the craziest ideas from across the internet, our media, and our politics, all from an independent perspective. Before we get into our main topic for the day, a quick announcement. I will be on vacation all of next week, so no Brad vs. Everyone show. Unfortunately, I know you guys are going to miss me like crazy, but I will be visiting some friends in DC, then heading over to Amsterdam with my partner for a vacation, ultimately hitting up London to see our first ever real Chelsea FC game in person. We're really excited, but I will miss doing the show with you guys, and I can't wait to be back at it the week after next like normal. Now, without further ado, we've got to take a look at truly one of the most disturbing television segments I've seen in a long time, because CNN sat down with 3 trans-identifying minors and their parents for an interview about the state of trans issues with the big Supreme Court case that was just heard about laws banning medical transitioning of minors. And the interview was one of the most tragic and shocking things I've seen in some time. Take a listen to this first clip, what Violet, a 10-year-old who identifies as a trans girl, had to say in the opening clip of this interview. It's shocking stuff.
What concerns have you had about speaking out?
That I'm gonna be murdered. One day I'm gonna be walking down the street and somebody's gonna come up and shoot me or something.
That's a really scary thing to be worrying about at 10 years old.
Yeah, that should not be a worry.
Michelle, what's going through your mind as you hear your daughter say this?
It's just hard to hear her say that.
Wow, this is tragic, but not in the way they think it is. It's tragic that this 10-year-old has this fear, but it is absolutely unsubstantiated and totally divorced from reality. There's nobody going around killing 10-year-old trans kids, and there's no statistical basis for the idea that they're at any heightened risk of murder compared to anyone else. And to suggest that and to have scared your kid with paranoia and propaganda into this state of needless panic and doom and alarmism is horrific. It's horrible, but it's your fault. Mom, I can see your crocodile tears over this, but look in the mirror. You caused that fear by clearly exposing this child to huge doses of political propaganda and misleading misinformation, because, again, there's no actual reason for this kid to have that fear, to be afraid of that. That is not a thing that happens at any sort of common frequency or rate. I mean, you can look at statistical data. I've done this, and the claims about trans people being murdered at elevated rates are not substantiated by the statistics. And to the extent any trans people are at a high rate of risk of being murdered or harmed, it tends to be transgender women of color adults who work in sex work. Okay, it's not 10-year-olds. That's not a thing. You've just scared your kid and traumatized your child needlessly. Congratulations, Mom of the Year. And just this CNN journalist nodding along like this is reasonable rather than absolutely batshit. It's just baffling to me. And guys, the segment really doesn't get less crazy.
And she asked me three questions after she heard who won the election. Are we gonna have to move? Are they gonna take me away from you? And am I not gonna be able to get my medicine? It's frightening.
Yeah, well, based on that little bit, I can see how this kid ended up scared and paranoid for no reason. I mean, these questions are not reasonable questions to be asking, but 10-year-olds do ask silly questions that don't make sense. And so your answer should have been, no, nobody is going to take you away from your parents. That's not a thing. As far as I'm aware, Republicans and Trump aren't trying to do that. And even if they were, there's no reason to believe it would be successful. Like, it's not a thing. In fact, around this debate, the only kids being taken away from parents that I'm aware of is parents having their parental rights stripped when they refuse to affirm people's their kids' gender identity in some left-wing places and states like California. So as far as I'm aware, yeah, that's only happening in one direction. So you should be reassuring your child, but it seems like you're just playing into your kid's fear even more. Now, the question about whether this kid is going to still be able to access their medication is a valid question because to some extent that is up in the air. It's bans are being enacted at the state-by-state level, and Republicans are considering a federal prohibition or push. I think it should really stay at the state level because if the federal government can come in and ban it nationwide, well, the next time Democrats come in, they could just reverse that and say, no, all 50 states must allow it. And I think it makes more sense to have this be a state-by-state policy level decision. But even if they were to do that, the reason they would be taking away that medication is because it is not safe and it is not statistically proven to be an effective treatment for youth gender dysphoria. And because children this young, like a 10-year-old natal male, cannot understand the lifelong ramifications of being on puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones and never going through your birth sex puberty, I mean, that likely and most often leads to lifelong issues with sexual misfunctioning and infertility. That's not something a 10-year-old can consent to. So in that sense, if the medication is being taken away from your child, that might actually be a good thing in your kid's best interest. Though I understand that when you're so deep down this road and so ensconced into this movement and this propaganda, it wouldn't feel that way. Now, here's the part of the interview where the CNN reporter really rubbed me the wrong way with very misleading framing of her question. Take a listen.
We've seen Republicans put a lot of money and energy into transgender issues. More than $200 million were spent this election cycle in anti-trans ads. What does that feel like to have so much attention by all these politicians on your identity?
So I will play the kid's response, but first, just a real quick note about this question. It's really misleading and I think deceptive. The hundreds of millions of dollars that were poured into trans-related ads by Republicans were not put into anti-trans ads categorically, or even in most cases. I mean, the most famous one was the Trump campaign highlighting the fact that Kamala Harris previously supported and has never really disavowed having taxpayer-funded medical transition surgeries for inmates and detained illegal immigrants. Opposing that is not hateful against trans people. It's a question of taxpayer resources and whether it really makes sense to be funding what many view as elective treatments that are very costly for people who've broken the law or aren't even in this country legally. That's a legitimate debate and a point highlighting a position where Harris is out of step with the American people. It's not a transphobic, hateful, bigoted ad. And it also has really very little to do with these children because they are not inmates or undocumented immigrants, as far as I'm aware. Now, generally speaking, Republicans are, I think, going into rhetorical territory that is too toxic, too divisive, and too aggressive on trans issues. But that Trump ad that she's clearly referring to here wasn't an anti-trans ad in the way she's suggesting. So the whole framing of this bit is deceptive. But of course, that's of a piece with the rest of the interview, including how these kids responded.
It makes me feel like they think we're puppets that they can play with, and it's just so wrong.
It made you feel disrespected?
Made me feel like literally dead inside. It's probably honestly the worst thing I've ever felt. I've heard transphobic politicians that say, no, you have the wrong gender, you're confused, honey. No, myself is a fact, not an opinion. And they don't get to decide that for me. I get to decide that for myself.
Yeah, no. To be clear, guys, we are not going to be attacking or insulting Violet, who is just 10 years old, in any way. not in the comments section. If I see you demeaning or being mean or insulting, I will delete your comment and I may take away your commenting privileges. This is a child who is in many ways a victim in this situation, but I still will disagree with what Violet said. Your identity is not a fact. Your subjective sense of self-identification is not something other people have to agree with, and it is in no sense objectively true. It is objectively true that you are biologically male if you are a trans girl or a trans woman. And even if you identify as a girl, other people can disagree about what constitutes gender and sex and whether you can truly change. And that is a matter of opinion, not fact. And I'm sorry, but we are not in the business of taking what 10-year-olds say as gospel. And policymakers shouldn't be doing that because that would be absurd. 10-year-olds have a tenuous grasp on reality and underdeveloped, mushy brains. We do not defer to them on complicated questions of science, medical ethics, morality, and public policy, nor should we.
The Supreme Court is taking on a Tennessee law that is banning gender-affirming care for minors. So this is things like hormones, puberty blockers. Roughly 24 states have passed restrictions on gender-affirming care. It's clearly a big political issue, but I want to understand what gender-affirming care means for you. Why is this something that's important for your family?
I don't know what kind of care my kids are going to need in the future, but I also believe in body autonomy and parental rights. And so my kids deserve access to the same life-saving care that other cisgender kids are receiving without politicians interfering.
You want the choice.
Yes.
So I understand this argument. I do. As I've mentioned, I am a big believer in parental rights and autonomy, but it is not unlimited. And I'm sure that these parents would agree that something like gay conversion therapy should not be allowed for minors because it doesn't work, it's fraudulent, it's a form of abuse, and even parents' rights to make medical decisions about their children is not unlimited. It's not always just between them and their doctor. So then it just becomes a question of where we draw that line. And because these transition treatments are so statistically unsupported and unproven and so poorly studied with such low quality data, and because they have life-altering, lifelong ramifications like the inability to ever experience actual proper sexual functioning or lifelong infertility in some or many cases, reasonable people can and do believe that these treatments fall on the other side of the line, beyond what parents should be free to choose. So I understand why they feel this way. I think most people don't want to have the government interfering with their parenting decisions, but we all do agree that there's a limit, and what they're doing to their kids is beyond that limit, in my book.
I think if politicians really were in it for the kids' sake, then they would take the time and listen to what they have to say. I think that they would focus on real things like climate change instead of using our identities as a pawn just to get votes or just to stay in an office. Me and my family have spent a lot of our time going back and forth to our state capital in Arizona. The amount of times I've been disrespected, misgendered, dismissed just because of how young I am by these people who want to protect me.
Well, I am truly sorry if anybody has been disrespectful to this teenager, but people should not be just blindly listening to trans kids. In no other area of healthcare is people's self-perception of what works really viewed as solid scientific data or evidence. No, you have to look at actual data and studies and outcomes, not just how people feel. And I'm sorry, but it is okay in some situations to dismiss people's views because of their age. I mean, I don't think public policymakers should be making rules and laws about complicated debates of medical ethics and science based on what teenagers are telling them. Sorry, no. And also, for every kid like this that's saying, oh, these treatments help me, well, we've got other detransitioners who went down this path, were pushed into it by their friends or TikTok and made these alterations to their body they can never undo, telling lawmakers that actually this is harmful and should be restricted. So is it listen to trans kids, even if those kids are no longer trans, or is it just listen to the ones like you? See how it's not that simple? We're going to skip a little bit ahead in this segment to check out a portion that kind of shows how these kids, I think, have been fed a kind of hyperbolic and alarmist narrative.
The first time Daniel ever lobbied, he was 9 years old, and he's going to be 18 next August, 2 months after this ruling. And so he will have spent a majority of his life defending his existence. And so I just want Daniel and Violet and Dylan to live in a world that just lets them be, and in a world where they can be safe. I really worry that the rhetoric has gotten so bad.
So I do agree that the rhetoric has gotten really nasty and should be toned down, but that absolutely did come, in large part at least at first, from the pro-trans side, which accused anybody who was against minors transitioning of supporting trans genocide and supporting policies that will lead to a wave of trans suicide and all this stuff that is not true and not statistically based in evidence. Even the ACLU lawyer, Chase Strangio, actually admitted that during the oral arguments, that there's not actually evidence this stuff reduces suicides. But again, it is not surprising to me that these kids are in this state of kind of delusional hysteria and distress when you listen to the things that the parents are saying. Like, this mom is saying that her transgender kid has been fighting for his right to exist. No, lady. Nobody has ever said or been arguing that your kid shouldn't exist or doesn't exist. That's a made up battle you've been having in your mind for years, apparently, shadow boxing with an enemy that doesn't exist. They've questioned whether your female child is really a male, and they're entitled to question that. And they've questioned whether these radical new treatments with very little data about their efficacy or safety should be allowed to be given to minors. None of that is the same thing as denying your kids' right to exist. And that kind of hysterical and delusional rhetoric is exactly the kind of thing that has caused these kids emotional distress. And that's what's really harming them, if you ask me. Their parents' propaganda and delusion.
Do you feel like it's affecting your childhoods that you have to fight for your right to exist?
Yeah, because there's so many like racist, anti-trans people that I should be a kid at school right now worrying about my own stuff and like not having to do this.
So one, why is the CNN reporter playing into this and affirming the delusional narrative that these kids are fighting for their right to exist, even though nobody wants them to not exist or is trying to take out their existence? Like, that's just imaginary. And two, I actually agree. Violet should have been at the playground or in class and focused on normal kid things. But the ones who took that away from Violet are not Republican lawmakers, but activist parents who clearly craved their moment in front of the camera, craved their spotlight, and the sense of purpose that having a trans kid seems to have given them, and took that childhood away from them and made them into mini activists. That's not something most parents would do for their kid, and for good reason. But despite what they're saying, they weren't forced to do that with this imaginary struggle over whether they can even exist. It's actually something your parents chose, and I'm sorry they chose that, but it's ultimately on them.
And we know that the statistics around the loss of life of Black and brown trans women is already high.
This is so wild. None of these kids are Black or brown or trans women. So you're just like throwing in random buzzwords because you've heard propaganda talking points from alphabet activists. I've run the numbers and the data on this, and Black transgender people are actually murdered at lower rates than Black people generally speaking. What's more, while all of these deaths in these cases are tragic, I mean, any loss of human life is a terrible thing, many of the Black trans women routinely profiled as victims of trans genocide weren't killed because they were trans. They were killed as a part of oftentimes the sex work industry they were participating in, which is tragic, but is kind of a different issue. And in some cases were killed in circumstances that had actually nothing to do with them being trans. So again, we're just throwing in woke buzzwords and talking points into this conversation and scaring the kids with stuff that's not based in fact. Great job. We just got the Parents of the Year on display in this segment.
What do you hope will come as a result of you speaking out and making your voices heard?
I wish people could see that our children are who they are and believe them and leave our families alone. Like, I would give anything to be a really boring PTA mom. And instead, I'm reading policy, like ways in which I can convince politicians to see my child as a full human being.
I'm sorry, that's such bullshit. First, everyone sees your child as a full human being. Nobody's saying that your child isn't a full human being, and all reasonable people on either side of this debate, of course, agree that your child is entitled to dignity and respect. But yeah, I just don't believe this woman. She doesn't want to be a normal PTA mom. She's loving the spotlight. She loves that she's this activist, hero, queen mom who's standing up for her kid's existence, even though it's mostly an imaginary struggle, shadowboxing with a made-up villain in her head. And her kid is about to turn 18, as she mentioned earlier in this video, which means her kid will still be able to access gender transition treatments. And this issue will largely no longer affect their life, but she's still here, protesting at the Supreme Court, going on CNN, and making this her personality. So I'm not buying that this woman just wants to be a normal, bland, vanilla PTA mom. I think that's bullshit, honestly, I do. But then again, that's how I feel about basically this entire segment.
I'm hopeful that we can just be normal children in a normal world where people don't judge us and where we can just be ourselves and shine like a star.
Okay, that's the end of this horrific segment on CNN. I agree, Violet, that's what I want for you. I want you kids to be happy and healthy and to have had productive childhoods and gotten to grow up like anybody else. But I fear your parents have stolen that from you. And I have a lot of anger with the parents and the political propaganda that's been fed onto these kids to have put them into a delusional state of hysteria. It appears the whole thing is a tragedy, but not in the way CNN attempted to frame it as one. Honestly, I want to pull my hair out. Like, not many things that I cover, I'm pretty unflappable. Not many things genuinely rattle me. That segment did. You guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please do hit the like button, make sure you're subscribed, all that. I'm not even going to go through that. I'm a little shaken up. I'm going to just try to finish the show.